Have you ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted the most? Margaret, a woman in her 60s, spent her entire life supporting her family, sacrificing everything for her son and daughter-in-law. But when she discovers her credit card charged $53,000 for luxury gifts and a lavish trip to Paris, her world shatters. The betrayal doesn't end there. A text from her daughter-in-law mocking her generosity is the final straw. But Margaret isn't the helpless woman everyone thinks she is. This time she's fighting back. Will she reclaim her life and expose the truth, or will her family's lies tear her apart? Stay tuned for a gripping story of betrayal, revenge, and the ultimate fight for justice. Margaret had spent over 6 decades of her life dedicated to caring for her family. As a mother and grandmother, she poured all her energy into ensuring her son, John, and his wife, Eliza, had everything they needed. She'd sacrificed countless moments of her own happiness for their well-being. But what hurt the most was how little it seemed to matter now. The cold December air crept through the cracks of the old house as Margaret stood in the kitchen, her hands moving skillfully as she prepared the Christmas dinner. The turkey roasted in the oven, filling the house with a comforting aroma. She set the table with fine china she'd bought years ago, carefully placing the plates and silverware with a sense of pride. The holiday season was her time to shine, to bring her family together in the warmth of tradition. But this year, something felt off. Her heart had already sensed it, but it wasn't until the phone call from John and Eliza that the final blow landed. "Mom, we've decided to spend Christmas with Eliza's family this year." John's voice came through the phone with an unexpected coldness. "We won't be able to make it to your place." The words stung like ice, each syllable slicing through Margaret's sense of worth. She had been expecting the usual familiar hum of excitement from her son, but instead, there was a flat, detached tone. "Oh, I see," Margaret managed to choke out, trying to keep her voice steady. Her hands shook as she set down the carving knife she had been holding. The silence on the other end of the line made the weight of the words sink in even deeper. This wasn't just about a missed Christmas dinner. This was about being pushed aside, no longer needed. "I'm sorry, Mom," John continued, though his apology felt hollow. "We've already made plans. You understand, right? Eliza's parents really want us there." Margaret forced a smile, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. "Of course, John, I understand," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but deep inside, her heart was breaking. She had always been there for John, supporting him financially when he and Eliza struggled with their bills, paying for their rent when they couldn't afford it, and even buying them new furniture when their apartment was falling apart. She had sacrificed her own comfort to help them build their life, and now she was being cast aside as if she no longer mattered. After hanging up the phone, Margaret stood motionless in the kitchen, her hands still resting on the table where she had been arranging the Christmas dishes. The room felt colder than it ever had before, despite the warmth of the oven. The laughter of her grandchildren, which she had once imagined filling the house during the holidays, now seemed like a distant dream. She blinked away the tears that threatened to fall and forced herself to take a deep breath. "Maybe I'm overreacting," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "It's just Christmas. It doesn't mean they love me any less." But deep down, Margaret knew that this wasn't just about the holiday. This was about years of sacrifice, years of giving, and not once feeling truly appreciated. She had always put her family first, always ensured that they had what they needed, often at the cost of her own well-being. And now, when she needed them most, they were turning their backs on her. With a heavy heart, Margaret slowly made her way to the dining table, her steps slow and deliberate, as if the weight of the moment was too much for her to carry. She sat down in the chair she had always occupied, staring at the empty seats around her, the chairs that should have been filled with the people she loved most. As the minutes ticked by, Margaret felt a sense of emptiness take over her. The Christmas dinner she had spent hours preparing suddenly felt like a cruel reminder of the hollowness she now felt in her heart. It was as if all her efforts, her sacrifices, her love, meant nothing at all. She wanted to call John again, to beg him to reconsider, to remind him of all she had done for him and his family. But a voice inside her told her that it would only make things worse. The silence was the loudest thing in the room, and Margaret realized she could no longer ignore the truth. Her family, the ones she had given everything for, no longer cared the way they once did. The tears finally came, but they were quiet, almost invisible. As Margaret sat alone at the table, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a joyful occasion, Christmas was supposed to be a time for family, for love, for connection. But for Margaret, it had become a reminder of everything she had lost. Margaret sat by the window in her quiet, empty house, staring out into the cold Christmas day. The frosty air outside matched the chill in her heart. The snow had begun to fall, coating the world in a serene, frozen blanket. But inside, her world felt anything but peaceful. The house, once filled with the laughter of her children and grandchildren, now stood still, like a monument to the past. The silence was deafening. She traced her finger across the condensation on the window, the soft fog forming as she exhaled. Her thoughts drifted to the many years she had spent giving everything for her family. The countless sacrifices she had made, working long hours, sacrificing her own dreams, and offering financial support whenever they needed it. She remembered taking out loans to help pay for John's education, helping Eliza buy furniture for their first home, and even giving them money for their vacations, believing it was all part of being a mother and a family. And yet, here she was, abandoned on Christmas Day, sitting alone with no one to share it with. Her son John and his wife Eliza were the people she had done everything for, but now they were gone, physically absent and emotionally distant. The pain she felt wasn't just from their absence, but from the realization that she had spent years building a life for them, only to be cast aside when she was no longer useful to them. The lump in Margaret's throat grew, and her eyes welled up with tears. She wiped them away quickly, determined not to let herself break down again. She tried to remind herself that this was just a holiday, just another Christmas that wasn't going to go as planned. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. This wasn't just about a holiday dinner. This was about years of giving, years of pouring her love and support into a family that no longer seemed to care. She was no longer the mother they turned to for help. She was now the person they avoided. As she sat there lost in her thoughts, the phone rang, snapping her out of her stupor. Startled, she picked it up without checking the caller ID. It was Sarah, her old friend from years ago. Margaret hadn't heard from Sarah in months, and her heart skipped a beat. Sarah was the one person who had always been there for her, especially during the tougher times. But after Margaret became more consumed with her family, especially after Eliza entered the picture, Sarah had gradually faded from her life. Margaret had been too busy to notice, too wrapped up in her own family's demands to realize that Sarah was slipping away. "Margaret, it's been too long." Sarah's voice was warm and familiar, but there was a hint of sadness in it that made Margaret pause. "It has, Sarah," Margaret replied softly, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "I've just been busy." "I can imagine," Sarah said, "but I've been meaning to call to check in on you. How are you doing?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how to answer. She wanted to tell Sarah everything, the loneliness, the pain, the way her own son and daughter-in-law had discarded her. But something held her back. She didn't want to burden Sarah with her troubles. "I'm fine," Margaret said instead, forcing a smile into her voice. "Just getting through the holidays." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Sarah spoke again, her voice much quieter this time. "Margaret, I've been hearing things. I don't know if you're aware, but Eliza has been saying things behind your back." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Eliza, her daughter-in-law? What could she possibly be saying about her? Margaret's mind raced with confusion and disbelief. Sarah continued, her voice lower, filled with concern. "She said that you're a burden on the family," Sarah said, "that you're too demanding, that you always expect something in return for all the help you give, and that you shouldn't be included in family gatherings anymore. I don't know how to tell you this, but but she's been saying that you're the one holding them back." The words hit Margaret like a slap to the face. She felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. Eliza, the woman she had treated like a daughter, had been speaking about her like this? After everything she had done for them? The loans, the gifts, the countless hours she had spent caring for them and their home, and now Eliza was calling her a burden? Margaret couldn't process it. It felt like a betrayal, a cold, harsh reality that she wasn't prepared for. "Are you sure?" Margaret's voice trembled. "Are you absolutely sure she said that?" "I'm afraid so," Sarah replied gently. "I've heard it from a few people, Margaret. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but I thought you should know." Margaret sat in stunned silence, her mind whirling. How could Eliza, who had always smiled and thanked her for everything, say such cruel things behind her back? It felt like everything she had ever done for her son and his wife had been a lie. All those years of financial support, all those moments when she thought she was helping them build a life together, now felt worthless. She wasn't a loving mother or grandmother in their eyes. She was a nuisance, an inconvenience. Her chest tightened, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. She wiped them away angrily, not wanting to show weakness, but feeling a crushing weight of hurt and betrayal that she could no longer ignore. The worst part wasn't just Eliza's words, it was that John had to know about this. Margaret had always thought she was doing things for her son's benefit, for the good of their family. But now she realized, in the cruelest way, that she had been used, taken advantage of, and cast aside. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her fingers gripping the edge of the old wooden surface. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows on the walls. But the warmth it provided did little to ease the coldness that had settled in her heart. The phone call from Sarah, the hurtful words from Eliza, had shattered her sense of family, of trust. She knew with a growing certainty that she could no longer keep pretending everything was okay. It was time for a change, a decisive break from the cycle of giving without receiving anything in return. For years, Margaret had willingly helped her son, John, and his wife, Eliza. She had paid their bills, co-signed loans, and given them everything they asked for, believing it was what mothers did. She had worked tirelessly, sacrificing her own needs and desires to support their dreams. But now, after being cast aside and humiliated, she realized how little that had meant. Her sacrifices had been taken for granted, her love abused, and now it was time to stop. The decision to cut them off financially was not an easy one. It felt like severing the last tie to the family she had built. She had always thought that helping them was her duty, her way of showing love. But now, in the silence of her kitchen, she felt something far more important: self-respect. Margaret stood up and walked over to the small desk in the corner of the room, where her checkbook and banking documents were neatly organized. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for her bank. The call connected quickly, and she was greeted by the polite voice of a bank representative. "Good morning, ma'am. How may I assist you today?" "I'd like to cancel all automatic transfers I've set up for my son, John Foster, and his wife, Eliza," Margaret said, her voice steady but firm. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Certainly, ma'am. May I confirm your account information to proceed?" Margaret provided the necessary details, her fingers trembling slightly as she entered the information. She had spent years transferring money to John and Eliza, but today, for the first time, she felt in control. The representative confirmed the cancellation of the transfers and assured Margaret that everything had been processed. As she hung up the phone, a sense of relief washed over her. She knew it wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a significant first step. She had taken her power back. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though she was finally putting herself first. But the relief was short-lived. Not more than an hour later, the mailbox outside her front door creaked open, and Margaret walked over to retrieve the mail. Among the usual bills and flyers, one envelope caught her attention, a letter from the bank. Her stomach tightened as she tore it open. "Dear Mrs. Foster," the letter began. We are writing to inform you of a recent loan application submitted by your son, John Foster, and his wife, Eliza Foster. As part of the loan agreement, they have signed on your behalf for the refinancing of an existing loan. This new contract will affect your account immediately. Please contact us for more details. Margaret felt as though the floor had been ripped from beneath her. Her heart raced as she read the letter again, trying to process what she had just read. John and Eliza had signed a contract in her name, without her consent or knowledge, to take out a new loan. They had taken her financial resources and used them as though she were nothing more than an instrument, a tool to prop up their failing finances. Margaret sank into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Her first instinct was to call the bank, to demand an explanation, but she already knew what it meant. It meant they had betrayed her. It meant that all this time they had never truly seen her as family. To them, she wasn't a mother or a grandmother. She was just a source of money. The sense of betrayal hit harder than any of the cruel words Sarah had passed on to her. She had trusted John, trusted Eliza, and for years she had thought they valued her support. But now she could see the truth. She was nothing more than a means to an end. Margaret stood up, pacing the small kitchen, her mind racing. She had been so naive. She had poured so much of herself into this family. And for what? To be used, manipulated, and discarded when they had no more need for her. She had given them her money, her time, and her love, only to be treated like an afterthought. Her thoughts swirled in a blur of anger and hurt. She knew she needed to act. She had to protect herself. She couldn't let them continue to use her this way, to continue to take from her without any regard for her feelings. She grabbed the phone again and dialed the number for her lawyer, her fingers trembling as she waited for the connection. When the lawyer answered, Margaret spoke with determination. "I need you to help me stop this loan," she said. "John and Eliza have used my name without my consent, and I want it stopped. I want everything reversed." The lawyer assured her that they would look into the matter immediately and begin the process of canceling the loan and filing the necessary legal actions to protect her assets. Margaret hung up the phone, her chest tight with a mixture of anger and resolve. As the evening drew closer, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table, the weight of her decision sinking in. It wasn't just about the money. It was about respect, about setting boundaries, and about finally taking control of her life. She had spent far too long putting others first, and now it was her turn to take care of herself. Margaret sat in the dimly lit living room, the evening's chill settling in. The house felt empty, quieter than ever, as the walls echoed the sound of her thoughts. After all that had happened, she felt as though her life had turned into a series of lies. She had spent years believing in the family she had worked so hard to build, but now everything felt like a facade. The image of her son and daughter-in-law, the people she trusted most, had shattered. They had used her, manipulated her, and now they were pretending as though nothing had changed. As she stared at the dim glow of the lamp, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't stay silent anymore. The trust that had once existed between her and her son had been broken. She had been a mother who gave selflessly, but it was clear now that her giving had only made them more dependent and ungrateful. She needed to reclaim what had been taken from her dignity, her financial independence, and most of all, her peace of mind. It was time to stand up for herself. With determination, she reached for her phone. She started drafting an email to her lawyer, outlining the next steps to undo the damage caused by John and Eliza. She wanted to make sure that her finances were completely protected and that the loan Eliza had fraudulently signed in her name was nullified. Margaret felt a new sense of power rising within her. This was the first time in a long while that she wasn't thinking about others, but about what was best for her. But as the evening wore on, just as she was about to hit send on the email, the doorbell rang. Margaret froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the thought of another intrusion into her already fractured life made her heart race. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her pants as she walked toward the door. When she opened it, there stood Eliza, her daughter-in-law, looking somewhat sheepish but trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "Margaret, can I come in?" Eliza asked, her voice softer than usual, almost apologetic. Margaret hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. Eliza walked in, her movements hesitant as though she didn't want to overstep. Margaret closed the door behind her, eyeing Eliza with caution. Her heart was heavy with confusion, unsure of what Eliza wanted. But more than that, Margaret was exhausted. She was tired of being used, tired of always being the one to give without ever getting anything in return. "I wanted to apologize," Eliza began, her voice faltering slightly. "I know things have been tense lately, and I feel like I've been distant. I'm sorry." Margaret didn't know what to say. The words "I'm sorry" felt hollow after everything that had happened. Eliza had taken advantage of her, and now, with a forced apology, she seemed to want to pick up where they left off. "I know I've made mistakes," Eliza continued, her eyes avoiding Margaret's gaze. "I know I've hurt you, and that was never my intention. You've been so kind to John and me, and I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." Margaret listened, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure whether she could believe Eliza's words or if this was just another manipulation, but there was something in Eliza's voice, something that made Margaret feel both sorrow and hope. Maybe Eliza was finally seeing the consequences of her actions, but Margaret had learned too. She couldn't be fooled again. "What do you want, Eliza?" Margaret asked, her voice steady, but there was a quiet undercurrent of pain. "What are you really here for?" Eliza took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for something difficult. "Margaret, we've hit a rough patch. John and we need help. We're in debt, and I don't know what else to do." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She knew that Eliza was trying to pull on her sympathies, but she also felt a pang of genuine concern. After all, this was her family, her son and his wife, whom she had spent so many years trying to support. But as Eliza's words hung in the air, Margaret felt a deep sense of clarity. She knew that this moment, however difficult, was her opportunity to make the right choice. "We need your help, Margaret," Eliza said, her voice trembling now, more vulnerable than Margaret had ever heard it. "Without your support, we might lose everything. John is already so stressed, and I'm trying to hold it all together, but we can't do it without you." Margaret's chest tightened as she processed Eliza's words. She had heard this before. The same desperate plea for help, wrapped in a veneer of concern, was how they had manipulated her in the past. And now, here it was again. The same story, the same false promises. The part of her that wanted to help, the motherly instinct, wanted to reach out to fix things for them. But then Margaret remembered everything. The loans, the years of financial sacrifice, and the betrayal that had come to light. She realized that if she continued to help them, she would never be able to break free from this vicious cycle. They would continue to use her, and she would continue to be their financial crutch. A wave of sadness washed over Margaret. She had given so much of herself, and now it felt like her kindness had become a weakness. But she knew, deep down, that this was the moment she had to make a choice for herself. She couldn't keep enabling them, not anymore. "I can't do this anymore, Eliza," Margaret said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of her decision. "I've given you everything, but I can't keep sacrificing myself for you and John. I've done enough. You need to figure this out on your own." The silence between them stretched for a moment, and Margaret saw Eliza's face falter, the facade of vulnerability slipping away. But Margaret stood firm, her heart heavy but resolute. She knew this was the right choice, even if it hurt. The cold air of the early morning wrapped itself around Margaret as she stepped outside to meet Sarah. It had been so long since they'd spoken in person. Time had slipped away between them like sand in an hourglass, with Margaret's life consumed by family obligations and Sarah fading into the background. But today, there was a sense of urgency in Sarah's voice when she had called, and Margaret, feeling the weight of her decisions, agreed to meet. Sarah had always been a voice of reason in Margaret's life, a friend who would listen without judgment, who would offer advice that cut through the clutter of Margaret's emotions. As Margaret walked to the small cafe where they had agreed to meet, she reflected on the many years she had spent building a life around her family, particularly her son John. She had always believed that a mother's love should know no bounds, but lately it felt like that love had been used, twisted, and discarded. She arrived at the cafe, and there, sitting at a corner table, was Sarah. She hadn't changed much over the years. Her hair was still that shade of auburn that Margaret had always admired, and her smile was warm, inviting. But there was a new sadness in Sarah's eyes, one that Margaret couldn't ignore. "Margaret?" Sarah said, standing to greet her. There was a tenderness in her voice that made Margaret feel like she was returning to a place she hadn't visited in years, a place of unconditional love and understanding. "I'm so glad you agreed to meet." Margaret smiled faintly, her heart heavy. "It's been too long, Sarah. I've missed you." They sat down, the conversation flowing easily at first, as it always did between them. But soon, the underlying tension Margaret had been feeling surfaced. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been nothing but supportive for them, John, Eliza. But now they've turned their backs on me. It's like all these years of giving have meant nothing." Sarah listened patiently, then leaned forward, her eyes soft with concern. "Margaret, you can't keep carrying the weight of their choices. It's not your responsibility to save them anymore." "But they're my family," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't just abandon them." "You're not abandoning them," Sarah countered gently. "You're letting them stand on their own. You've given so much of yourself already, and look where it's gotten you. You deserve to have peace, Margaret. You deserve to live a life where you aren't just a means to an end for them." Margaret's heart ached as Sarah's words sank in. She thought of all the sacrifices she had made for John and Eliza. There had been days when she worked long hours, late into the night, to make sure they had what they needed. She had put aside her own dreams, her own desires, just to ensure her family was taken care of. But now, it felt like all that effort had been for nothing. They didn't appreciate it. As Sarah's words echoed in her mind, Margaret found herself reflecting on the past. Her thoughts drifted back to when she and David, her late husband, were young. They had struggled in those early years, working tirelessly to build a life. Margaret remembered the long hours David had spent at the construction site while she worked double shifts at the diner to make ends meet. Their sacrifices weren't easy, but they had done it together, always with the hope that their son would one day appreciate all they had done. She thought of John, a little boy full of promise, who had grown into the man she had hoped for, strong, smart, and capable. But somehow, over the years, her son had changed. The man who once called her for advice, who looked up to her for guidance, now barely acknowledged her, except when he needed something. "I've given them everything," Margaret murmured, her voice breaking as the tears threatened to fall. "And now they don't even care." Sarah reached across the table and took Margaret's hand in hers. "I know you've done everything for them, but it's time to stop. You're not responsible for their happiness, Margaret. You're responsible for your own." Margaret wiped her eyes, feeling the weight of Sarah's words pressing down on her. But just as she began to absorb what Sarah was saying, Sarah dropped a bombshell that left Margaret stunned. "Margaret," Sarah said softly, her voice tinged with sadness, "I need to tell you something else, something I learned recently." Margaret looked at Sarah, waiting for her to continue. "I found out that John has been borrowing money from another source. I didn't want to believe it at first, but it's true. He's been taking out loans from a different lender without telling you. And do you know what they've been using the money for?" Sarah paused, her gaze sympathetic. "They've been throwing extravagant parties, hosting lavish dinners with their friends. They're living it up while you're sitting here, alone and struggling." Margaret's heart stopped. The world around her seemed to blur as Sarah's words sank in. John, Her son, whom she had supported financially all these years, had been borrowing money from someone else, using it for lavish events, while she had given everything she could just to keep their lives afloat. The sense of betrayal hit her like a wave. She had been working herself to the bone, pouring everything into their lives, and they were spending that money on luxury. She had been nothing more than a tool, a financial safety net, for them to fall back on when it suited them. And now, they were enjoying the fruits of her labor, while she was left with nothing. "How could he do this?" Margaret whispered, the shock and pain in her voice evident. "How could I have been so blind?" Sarah squeezed her hand, her expression soft with understanding. "You didn't want to believe it. You loved your son, Margaret, but now you need to accept the truth. They used you, and it's time to stop letting them." Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The past, all those years of giving, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. She had been used, taken advantage of, and now her son didn't even care enough to tell her Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the letter from her bank. The words blurred in front of her as the full weight of the betrayal hit her like a wave. Her son, John, and his wife, Eliza, had been living a lie, using her for their own selfish gain. The years of financial support, the emotional investments, the countless sacrifices, it had all been for nothing. She had given everything to them, and in return, they had taken her generosity for granted. But now, Margaret was determined to uncover every secret they had kept hidden from her. She could no longer ignore the growing feeling of betrayal that had started to fester within her. She had been living in the shadows of her own family's lies, but not anymore. It was time to expose the truth. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and made a call. She had to know everything, every detail about the loans, the spending, the lies. She had to find out just how deep the deception went. The phone rang twice before it was answered by a bank representative. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Foster," the voice on the other end said, its tone polite yet detached. "How can I assist you today?" "I need a full account statement," Margaret said, her voice firm despite the anxiety bubbling in her chest. "I want to know where the money has gone, everything, all the transactions associated with my accounts." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Certainly, Mrs. Foster. I will have the details sent to you immediately." Margaret hung up and waited. Her mind raced as she thought about all the times she had given John and Eliza money, all the times she had covered their bills, never once suspecting that they were using her in such a cruel way. The silence of the house seemed deafening as she sat there, waiting for the bank statement. She could feel the anger bubbling inside of her, but there was also a deep sadness, a sorrow for the relationship she had lost with her son. When the bank's email arrived, Margaret opened it without hesitation. As she scanned the details, her stomach twisted. Thousands of dollars had been spent on luxuries, shopping sprees, expensive dinners, high-end gifts for Eliza's friends, while John and Eliza had repeatedly claimed to be struggling financially. It became painfully clear that every word they had said about their financial hardship had been a lie. The money she had given them wasn't to help with their basic needs. It was for their personal indulgence, their desire to live a life of extravagance, while she had been left in the dark. The more Margaret read, the more the rage burned in her chest. John had used her name to sign contracts for loans, taking out money without her knowledge or consent. He and Eliza had even gone as far as using Margaret's assets to buy luxury items for themselves, while pretending to be victims of financial misfortune. The trust she had placed in them, the love she had given them, had been utterly and completely abused. Her hands shook with fury as she reread the transactions. There, in black and white, was the proof. John and Eliza had manipulated her for their own gain, and now they had turned their backs on her. The very people she had trusted the most had used her as a tool to finance their lavish lifestyles, all while lying to her face about their struggles. "Unbelievable," Margaret whispered to herself, her voice thick with emotion. She couldn't believe what she was reading. She felt sick to her stomach, a mix of betrayal and anger coursing through her veins. As the realization set in, Margaret began to piece together the true nature of her relationship with John and Eliza. They weren't the people she had thought they were. They weren't the son and daughter-in-law she had lovingly cared for, who had once been grateful for her support. They were opportunists, taking advantage of her kindness without a second thought. The betrayal stung more than she could ever have imagined. The weight of it felt like a physical presence, pressing down on her chest. The years of giving, of loving, now seemed like a cruel joke. She had given so much, and for what? To be used, lied to, and discarded when she was no longer useful to them? Margaret stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor as she paced around the room. The anger within her was almost too much to contain. How could they do this to me, she thought. How could John, my own son, treat me like this? Her hands clenched into fists as she thought about how she had always been there for them, always there to support, to give, to help. And yet, they had taken it all without a second thought. They had manipulated her, and now they were living in luxury, while she was left to pick up the pieces of her broken trust. A new resolve settled over Margaret. She was done. She could no longer play the role of the generous mother, endlessly giving without receiving anything in return. She was done being their pawn. It was time to take control of her life, to protect herself from the people who had taken advantage of her for so long. Margaret knew that she couldn't undo the past, but she could take steps to make sure that John and Eliza never had access to her finances again. And more importantly, she could begin to rebuild her own sense of self-worth. As Margaret looked at the documents in front of her, a sense of clarity washed over her. She was done playing their game. She would no longer be their financial crutch. The next steps would be difficult. Facing John, confronting him with the truth, but Margaret knew it was necessary. She couldn't keep living in the shadow of their lies. She would reclaim her life, her peace, and her dignity. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room as Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone in her hands. She had made up her mind. It was time. She could no longer allow John and Eliza to control her life, to manipulate her with their lies. After everything she had uncovered, every dollar they had taken from her, every deceitful word they had uttered, she had nothing left to lose. She had to confront them, face to face, and demand answers. Margaret took a deep breath and dialed the number she had known by heart for decades. The phone rang twice before John picked up. "Hello?" His voice sounded casual, almost indifferent, and it made Margaret's stomach churn. "John," she said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "I need to talk to you and Eliza. I'm not asking, I'm telling. You need to come to the house right now." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and Margaret could almost hear the hesitation in John's voice. "What's going on, Mom? You sound upset." "I'll explain when you get here," she said, cutting him off. "Just come, both of you." After a moment of silence, John reluctantly agreed. "Okay, we'll be there in 30 minutes. Margaret hung up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years trying to maintain peace, trying to avoid confrontation, but today that peace had been shattered, and she was no longer afraid to face the truth. She had spent far too long protecting them, hiding behind her love for her son. But now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. She quickly gathered the documents from the bank, the statements, the loan contracts, the receipts for the extravagant spending, and laid them out on the kitchen table. She didn't want to hear any more excuses. She had the proof. They couldn't lie their way out of this. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The moment of reckoning had arrived. She opened the door to find John and Eliza standing on the threshold. Eliza's face was carefully neutral, but Margaret could see the unease in her eyes. John, on the other hand, looked as though he were already preparing to deflect, to avoid any responsibility. Margaret stepped aside, allowing them to enter, but her eyes were fixed firmly on them. "Sit down. Margaret said, her voice hard. She motioned to the chairs around the table. Both of them hesitated for a moment before sitting down, their eyes darting nervously to the stack of papers on the table. Margaret didn't waste any time. She pushed the pile of documents forward, her fingers trembling slightly as she slid them towards them. "I want you both to look at these," she said, her voice steady. "You've lied to me. You've used me for your own gain, and I've had enough. For years, I've supported you, emotionally, financially. And I thought that's what families do for each other. But instead, you've taken advantage of me. You've lied, and you've used my money to fund your luxuries while I've been left in the dark. You've made me feel worthless, as though my love and support meant nothing." John and Eliza exchanged a quick glance, but neither of them spoke. Margaret could see the guilt in their eyes, but she wasn't interested in hearing their excuses. She was done being the one who always forgave them. "I know everything," Margaret continued. "The loans you've taken out in my name, the money you've spent on extravagant dinners and gifts while you told me you were struggling. I've been your fool, and I won't stand for it anymore." The room was thick with tension as John and Eliza sat in stunned silence, unable to respond immediately. Margaret could see the shock on their faces, but she wasn't finished. She needed to make them understand the gravity of their actions. "I've given you everything, John, and now I'm taking it all back. No more money, no more support. You're going to have to find another way to live your life. And I'm not going to keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." John looked down at the table, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Margaret thought he might speak, but then he suddenly stood up. His face was flushed, his jaw tight with anger. "You don't get it, Mom," he said, his voice rising. "I never wanted any of this. I never wanted this family. All I've ever felt from you is pressure. From the moment I was born, it was always about what you wanted from me, what you expected from me. I never asked for any of it." Margaret's heart stopped. The words that came from her son's mouth hit her like a sledgehammer. John had never wanted this family. He had never wanted the love, the support, the sacrifices she had made for him. "You've always been too much, Mom," John shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You were always pushing me, always demanding more from me than I could give. And now, you're acting like you're the victim in all of this? Well, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being the one who's always trying to live up to your expectations. I'm done." Margaret stood frozen, her mind reeling from the revelation. John had never wanted her love, never wanted her support. She had spent her entire life thinking she was doing the right thing by helping him, by being there for him. But now, she realized that it was all for nothing. Her son had never wanted any of it. Eliza sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale. She didn't say a word as John continued his tirade, but Margaret didn't need Eliza to speak. The truth was clear now. Her son didn't love her the way she had loved him. He resented her for everything she had done, for every sacrifice she had made. Margaret's heart shattered, but she stood tall, facing John with a newfound strength. "If that's how you feel, then I guess we have nothing left to say to each other." The words hung in the air, final and undeniable. For the first time in years, Margaret felt free. Free from the lies, free from the manipulation. And as John stormed out of the house, Margaret knew that her life was about to change forever. Margaret sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the quiet broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Her hands were still trembling from the confrontation with John and Eliza, her son and daughter-in-law. The shock of John's words, his revelation that he had never truly wanted their family, was still raw in her heart. But strangely, she did not feel the crushing weight of despair she had expected. Instead, something else stirred within her: strength. Her years of sacrifice, of giving everything to her family without question, had been met with betrayal. But in this moment, something had shifted in Margaret. She had spent so much of her life putting her family first, believing that was what a mother was supposed to do. But now, it was time for her to put herself first. She couldn't let the actions of others define her, not anymore. Margaret took a deep breath and made a decision. She would not back down. She would not let this betrayal destroy her. Instead, she would take control, just as she had done in her younger years when she had fought through struggles with David. This wasn't the first challenge she had faced, and it wouldn't be the last. Her mind was made up. Margaret reached for the phone once more, dialing the number for her lawyer. The call was quick, and after a brief conversation, her next steps were clear. She was going to get back what was rightfully hers: the money, the loans, and the respect. She would demand that John and Eliza return the funds they had taken from her, every penny. A few hours later, the phone rang. It was Eliza. "Margaret, please listen." Eliza's voice was shaky, as if she was unsure of how to proceed. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. John and we were overwhelmed. We didn't know how to ask for help." Margaret clenched her jaw, the bitterness rising again. Eliza was always the one who spoke the softest, the most reasonable. But Margaret knew now that it was all part of the act. She wasn't fooled. "No!" Margaret replied firmly, her voice unwavering. "You lied to me, Eliza. You manipulated me, used me for your own gain, and now you want to apologize? You don't get to just take everything from me and expect me to forgive you." There was a long pause before Eliza spoke again. "What do you want from me, Margaret? Please, just tell me." "I want you and John to return every penny I've given you," Margaret said coldly. "You will pay back every loan, every dollar I've helped you with, and I want you both to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet without depending on me. No more handouts, no more favors. If you want to have a relationship with me, you will have to earn it, just like everyone else." Eliza stammered, but Margaret didn't wait for a response. She hung up the phone, her chest tightening with a mixture of anger and determination. She was done being the one who gave without question, without ever receiving anything in return. As she sat there, the weight of the decision starting to settle in, Margaret's mind began to wander. It wasn't just the money that had been stolen from her, it was her dignity. It was the years she had lost, the trust she had placed in people who had only used her. John and Eliza were no longer the family she had once known. They had become strangers who had taken advantage of her at every turn. But there was something else, something deeper that Margaret had begun to sense. As she thought back over the years, she remembered moments when Eliza had been oddly cold toward her. It wasn't just the occasional dismissiveness or the subtle snubs. It was the manipulation. Then it hit her. Eliza had been behind it all. From the very beginning, she had played the part of the sweet, innocent daughter-in-law, pretending to love Margaret, pretending to be grateful. But Margaret now realized that Eliza had been working to separate her from John all along. Eliza had always been the one to undermine her, to make her feel like she wasn't needed or wanted. And John, the son Margaret had raised and loved, had been swayed by her manipulation. The memories flooded back in a rush. Eliza's subtle comments, the way she always made Margaret feel like an outsider, the small, seemingly innocent remarks that had left Margaret questioning her place in their lives. Eliza had always been the one to suggest they spend more time with her family, subtly pushing Margaret aside. She had always been the one to plant seeds of doubt in John's mind, whispering that Margaret was too controlling, too demanding, that she didn't understand their struggles. But now, Margaret saw through it. Eliza had orchestrated this entire situation, from the lies about their finances to the manipulation of John. And John, in his anger and frustration, had been an easy target. The realization made Margaret's blood boil. She had been a pawn in Eliza's game, used for her money and discarded when she was no longer of any use. John had been weak, easily swayed by his wife's whispers, and now she could see it clearly. Eliza was the mastermind behind the betrayal. Margaret's heart felt heavy with the truth, but she also felt a fire in her chest. She wasn't going to let Eliza get away with it. She wasn't going to let either of them continue to manipulate her. This time, Margaret was taking control. The next day, she visited a lawyer's office again. She was done with the subtlety and the playing nice. She was going to do whatever it took to protect herself and reclaim her life. Margaret knew that confronting Eliza and John would be hard. It would be painful, and the guilt would try to creep back into her mind. But for the first time, Margaret understood that this was not just about money. This was about standing up for herself, demanding the respect she deserved, and never allowing anyone to take advantage of her again. Margaret felt a sense of empowerment that she hadn't known in years. She had taken control of her life, finally acknowledging that the love and sacrifices she had given to her son John and daughter-in-law Eliza had not been met with gratitude, but rather with exploitation. She wasn't about to let them continue to live off her hard-earned money and emotional investment. If they wanted to maintain the luxurious life they had come to expect, they would have to do so on their own. She knew that cutting off their finances was only the beginning. If they were truly going to learn a lesson, they had to face the consequences of their actions in a way that would make them realize how much they had taken for granted. It was time to make the next move. Margaret dialed John's number, her fingers tightening around the phone as she waited for him to pick up. He answered on the third ring, his voice uncertain, as if he knew something was coming. "Hello, Mom?" "John," Margaret began, her voice unwavering. "I've made some decisions, and I need you and Eliza to listen carefully. I'm no longer going to be your safety net. I've spent years providing for you, both financially and emotionally, and now I'm done." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Margaret could hear the sound of shuffling. Perhaps John looking for something to say, but she didn't let him interrupt. "You and Eliza will need to sell the house," Margaret continued. "I want you to downsize, find something within your budget, something you can afford without relying on me. This house," she said with a slight edge in her voice, "is no longer yours. I expect you to sell it and move on." The words hung heavy in the air between them, and Margaret could feel the tension growing. John was silent, and Margaret could almost hear the gears turning in his head. He had always expected things to come easily, to have someone to fall back on when things got tough. Now the harsh reality was setting in. "I can't just sell the house," John finally said, his voice cracking. "This is where we've built our life, Mom. You're asking too much. We can't afford to move. You don't understand what this will do to us." Margaret's heart hardened. She had heard it all before. The excuses, the pleas. But this time she wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let them manipulate her emotions anymore. "I understand perfectly, John," she replied coldly. "I understand that you've lived beyond your means for far too long. It's time to face the reality of your situation. The money I gave you was not meant to finance your lifestyle. It was meant to help when you were in need. You don't need a mansion to live comfortably. Sell the house, downsize, and figure out how to live within your means. I won't be bailing you out anymore." John's voice was tinged with frustration. "You're asking me to destroy everything we've built, Mom. You can't just expect us to lose everything overnight." "This is the consequence of your actions, John," Margaret said, her voice firm. "You've lived in a fantasy world where money from your mother was always there to cushion the blow, but that's not going to happen anymore. It's time to grow up and take responsibility for your own life." After a tense silence, John spoke again, his tone softer, almost pleading. "I'm sorry, Mom, but you don't get it. Without your help, we won't be able to make it. We've built our entire life here, and I don't know how we'll manage without you." Margaret's stomach turned as she heard the desperation in his voice. It was the same desperation she had heard time and time again, but this time there was no sympathy left in her heart for him. She had been the one to pick up the pieces for so long, and now it was his turn to face the consequences. "You'll manage, John," she said, her voice resolute. "You'll learn how to live without relying on me. It's time for you to figure out your own path, just like everyone else. You're capable of more than you think, but you have to stop depending on me for everything." After a long pause, John finally muttered, "I'll talk to Eliza. I don't know if she'll agree with this, but I'll tell her what you said. Do what you have to do, but it's happening. No more handouts from me. It's time you both face reality." Margaret hung up the phone with a finality that made her feel both empowered and strangely hollow. She wasn't sure what was to come next, but she knew this was the right thing to do. She had taken the first step in freeing herself from the years of manipulation and sacrifice. She would no longer be a tool for their selfishness. Hours passed, and Margaret's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. She had done everything she could for them, and now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. That night, as Margaret sat alone in her living room, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was Eliza standing at the door, her expression pained but determined. "I had to come, Margaret," Eliza said, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. "John and I talked, and we're not sure what to do, but we can't just sell the house. We built this life, and you can't just take it all away." Margaret stood up, her eyes locking onto Eliza's. She had expected this. Eliza was always the one to try to manipulate her with guilt, to make her feel like the villain. But this time, Margaret wasn't falling for it. "Eliza, you don't have a choice," Margaret said firmly. "You've lived beyond your means for far too long, and now you're going to face the consequences. I'm not giving in, and I won't let you manipulate me into doing so." Eliza's eyes widened in disbelief. "You don't understand, Margaret. Without this house, we'll have nothing. You can't take everything from us." "You've already taken everything from me," Margaret replied, her voice sharp. "And now, it's time to pay the price." Eliza stood there, speechless, as the weight of Margaret's words sank in. For the first time, Eliza realized that Margaret was done. There would be no more enabling, no more excuses. It was time for them to face the harsh reality they had created for themselves. The weeks that followed Margaret's decision were some of the most difficult yet freeing of her life. John and Eliza had not taken kindly to her demand. They argued, they cried, they even begged. But nothing she said seemed to shake their sense of entitlement. Each encounter left Margaret feeling more resolute, her heart heavy yet unyielding. She had been their provider for far too long, but now she had drawn the line. At first, John's response was shock and denial. He couldn't understand why Margaret was doing this to him. "You don't get it, Mom," he had pleaded, his voice cracking. "We need this house. It's not just about a roof over our heads. It's about everything we've built together. You can't just take it from us." But Margaret was unwavering. She had spent decades giving, expecting nothing in return. But this time, she was standing up for herself. Eliza was no better. She tried every trick in the book, from playing the victim to accusing Margaret of being heartless to even invoking the memory of her late husband, David. It didn't work. Nothing could make Margaret feel guilty anymore. She wasn't going to let them manipulate her any longer. The situation began to escalate. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with John, Margaret stood her ground, refusing to back down. His words stung, but she didn't flinch. She realized now that her actions were driven by a strength she had never known before. She had been weak for so long, giving endlessly to people who only took from her. It was time for that to end. "You don't care about me at all, do you, Mom?" John had shouted, his face flushed with anger. "I've given up everything just to keep up with you, and now you're just going to throw me aside?" Margaret had looked at him, calm and steady. "You've never understood, John. You've never understood what it really means to be a family." But as the days went on, John's anger began to turn into something else. The relentless demands and the guilt trips began to feel hollow. Margaret felt no more sorrow for them. There was only a growing sense of peace within her, the peace that came with standing up for herself for the first time in her life. She had freed herself from the burden of constantly trying to please them, from always being the one to fix their problems. It was not until 2 weeks later, during one of their last confrontations, that Margaret saw a change in her son. He came to her, looking more disheveled than ever. His face was drawn, and his eyes, those eyes that had once been full of pride, were now filled with something else. Regret. "Mom, can we talk?" he had asked quietly, his voice more subdued than Margaret had ever heard it before. She knew he had finally hit a wall. Margaret stood there for a moment, unsure if she was ready to open herself up to him again. But then she took a breath, and the years of love she had given him softened her heart just enough to listen. "I don't know what I've done, Mom. I thought I was doing what was best for me, but now I see that I've lost something that I'll never get back." His voice cracked, and for the first time in months, he looked like the young boy she had raised. The boy who had once looked up to her for everything. Margaret felt a mix of emotions swirl in her chest. Regret, sadness, but also a sense of relief. She had wanted him to realize the weight of his actions, and now it seemed he had. "I'm sorry, Mom," he continued, his eyes welling up. "I didn't see it before, but I see now that you've been the one who's always been there, always been strong. I've treated you like you were just a source of money, and I never realized how wrong I was. I was too selfish, too caught up in what I thought I deserved." Margaret didn't say anything right away. She could see that he was genuinely sorry, but she wasn't sure if it was too late. Still, something inside her softened. She had waited so long for him to recognize her sacrifices, for him to appreciate her, and now he was finally doing it. But Margaret had learned the hard way that words weren't enough. It wasn't just about an apology, it was about actions, about proving he could stand on his own without relying on her. "John, you've hurt me deeply," she said quietly, but with an undeniable firmness. "I've always been here for you, but I've spent too many years enabling you, giving you the things you should have earned. I'm sorry, but I can't just go back to what we had before. You have to take responsibility for your own life now." John nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I understand, Mom. I've lost you, and I know it's my fault, but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll start over. I'll find a way to fix this." For a brief moment, Margaret saw a glimpse of the man she had always hoped John would become, but she also knew that trust had to be earned, and it would take time for him to prove that he had truly changed. She wasn't ready to open the door to him fully just yet. "I hope you mean that, John," Margaret said, her voice softening just a little, "because this is your chance to prove it. But I'm not going to give you another chance to hurt me. You need to do the work." John's face was a mixture of regret and determination. "I will, Mom. I swear." As he left, Margaret sat down again, reflecting on what had just happened. She realized that John's apology didn't change the fact that she had been used, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to rebuild her life, to take care of herself, and finally honor the love she had always given freely. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she was worth it. Margaret woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains, casting a gentle glow over the room. The world outside was still, calm, as if waiting for the next chapter of her life to unfold. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. The weight that had long been a constant burden on her heart had been lifted. The decision to cut ties with John and Eliza had been difficult, but now it felt like the right one. She stretched her arms above her head, feeling the tightness in her muscles from years of carrying the emotional weight of others. As she sat up, a smile touched her lips. She had rediscovered something that had been lost, herself. The past few months had been a journey of self-discovery. Without the constant demands of her family weighing her down, Margaret had the time to explore what truly brought her joy. She had taken up gardening again, something she had loved to do when she was younger. The garden outside her house, once neglected, was now filled with vibrant flowers and plants, each one a symbol of her own rebirth. She had joined a local book club and found herself immersed in novels that sparked her imagination. She had even started taking long walks through the park, enjoying the simple pleasures of being alone with her thoughts. Each day was a new beginning. Margaret found herself laughing more, enjoying the little things she had once overlooked in the chaos of her responsibilities. She had begun to reclaim the parts of herself that she had lost while focusing so much on others. The energy she had given to her family for so long was now being channeled into nurturing her own soul. The freedom she had fought for was becoming a reality. As Margaret sat with a cup of tea one morning, reflecting on how far she had come, the doorbell rang. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready for any more confrontations. But then she stood up, walked to the door, and opened it to find John standing on the porch. His face was drawn, tired, and his eyes were red-rimmed, as though he had been crying or hadn't slept in days. Margaret's heart sank at the sight of him. It had been weeks since they had spoken, and although she had moved on from the pain, seeing her son like this brought back memories of the love she had once had for him. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to soften, but the resolve she had built over the past months quickly took hold again. "Mom," John began, his voice shaking, I've been thinking a lot about everything, about what I said, about what I did. I know I've hurt you, and I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try, please. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to do." Margaret stood silently, taking in the sight of him. She could see the regret in his eyes, but also a hint of something else. Desperation. John was used to getting what he wanted from her. He had always known that no matter how much he took, she would be there, ready to support him. But now, Margaret saw him for what he had become, a man who had been coddled and enabled for far too long, someone who had never learned the value of hard work, responsibility, or humility. "I know I've failed you, Mom," John continued, his voice breaking, "but I want to fix this. I want to be better. I've realized that I can't keep living like this. I'm asking for your help just one more time. Please, don't turn your back on me." Margaret's heart ached at his words, but she knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for. She had spent years supporting him, enabling him, and it had only led to his dependence on her. She had to let go, for both her sake and his. "John," she said softly, but firmly, "I can't help you anymore. Not the way you want me to. You need to stand on your own 2 feet. You have to learn how to take responsibility for your actions, for your life. You've had every opportunity to make something of yourself, and I've been there every step of the way, but you've taken it all for granted. I won't keep enabling you." John's face fell as he heard the finality in her voice. "But, Mom, I don't know how to do this on my own. I need you." Margaret took a deep breath. The pain in his eyes was hard to ignore, but she knew that giving in would only undo everything she had worked so hard to build for herself. "You've always had me, John," Margaret said, her voice steady, "but you've never truly needed me in the way I've been there for you. What you need now is to learn how to live without relying on me. You have the power to change your life, but only if you start taking responsibility for it." The silence between them was thick. John stood frozen, unable to speak, his eyes filled with both sorrow and frustration. Margaret stood her ground, refusing to budge. She knew this was the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was also the most important. She had spent too long allowing him to use her, to manipulate her into being his safety net. But now, she had drawn the line. "I'm sorry, John," Margaret said, her voice soft but unwavering. "But this is the only way you'll grow. You need to find your own path." With that, she turned and closed the door, leaving John standing on the porch, speechless and alone. As Margaret walked back into the house, she felt a mixture of sadness and relief. She loved her son, but she knew that this was the right thing to do. She had given him everything she had, but now it was time for him to learn how to give to himself. It wasn't about money or material things, it was about growth, about finding the strength to stand on his own. The weight that had once crushed her chest now lifted, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt the freedom that came from choosing herself. She had made a decision that would forever change the course of her life, and in doing so, she had taken a significant step toward her own happiness. The days after her conversation with John were quieter than Margaret had expected. She had expected guilt or even doubt to creep in. But as the silence of the house settled around her, she realized that her decision had been the right one. For so many years, she had sacrificed everything for her family, believing that if she just kept giving, they would come to appreciate her. She had poured her love into her son and daughter-in-law, but no matter how much she gave, it was never enough. No amount of sacrifice had earned her their respect. And now, as she stood on the threshold of a new chapter, Margaret understood that she could no longer live for others. She could no longer base her happiness on their gratitude or their approval. John and Eliza had shown her time and time again that they would never appreciate her the way she had hoped. Margaret wasn't just letting them go. She was letting go of the years of disappointment, the years of giving, and the emotional burden that had held her captive. Margaret had made the conscious decision to live for herself. She wasn't going to spend another day living in the shadows of their neglect. Her happiness, her peace of mind, depended on her choosing to move forward, not backward. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The freedom she had begun to feel in her own home was unlike anything she had experienced in years. She had started focusing on herself, reconnecting with the things that made her happy. Margaret had always loved reading, and now she found herself reading again, immersing herself in books that had nothing to do with obligations or the needs of others. It was a simple pleasure, but one that brought her so much joy. She began volunteering at the local community center, offering her time to help others. But this time, it was different. She was doing it because it brought her fulfillment, not because she was trying to fill a void created by her family's lack of gratitude. She loved helping others, but now it was on her terms. She wasn't obligated to anyone, and that made all the difference. Margaret also began to take better care of herself. She started going for walks every morning, something she had always wanted to do but never had time for. She noticed the little things, the way the sun rose over the horizon, the way the flowers bloomed in her garden, the sounds of the birds singing in the trees. These were the things that had been drowned out by years of worry, of giving. One afternoon, as Margaret walked through her neighborhood, she noticed something she had never really paid attention to before. A small, quaint coffee shop she had passed countless times. Something about it caught her eye, and she felt an urge to go inside. She stepped into the warm, inviting space, and immediately, a sense of calm washed over her. She ordered a cup of tea and sat by the window, taking in the peaceful atmosphere. It was in that moment that Margaret realized something profound. She had forgotten how to live for herself. For so long, she had lived in the shadows of other people's needs and wants, but now she was rediscovering herself. She wasn't defined by her relationships with John and Eliza. She was more than that. As she sipped her tea and watched the world go by, Margaret felt something stir within her. A deep sense of peace, of fulfillment, and of hope for the future. She wasn't stuck anymore. She wasn't weighed down by the past. She was free, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. Meanwhile, John and Eliza were still trapped in the mess they had created. Their world, once filled with luxury and entitlement, was beginning to crumble. The house had been sold, and they had moved into a much smaller apartment, struggling to make ends meet without the financial cushion that Margaret had once provided. The truth was hard for them to accept. John had never learned how to handle responsibility. Eliza, who had once been so manipulative, now found herself dealing with the consequences of her own actions. Margaret's absence was a void they couldn't fill. The lavish lifestyle they had come to expect, built on Margaret's generosity, had evaporated. They were left to face the harsh reality of their own choices. John's job was no longer enough to sustain their old way of life, and Eliza's attempts to secure better opportunities fell flat. They were drowning in debt, and the future seemed uncertain. Their marriage, once built on the illusion of comfort, was now being tested by their own shortcomings. Margaret couldn't bring herself to feel sorry for them. She had spent too many years enabling their behavior, allowing them to believe that their problems would always be solved by her. Now they were forced to face the consequences of their actions. She had made her choice, and it was time for them to make theirs. One evening, as Margaret sat in her living room, she thought about everything she had learned over the past few months. She had rediscovered herself. She had reclaimed her peace and her independence. She was finally living the life she deserved, a life free from the burdens of people who would never appreciate her. And in doing so, she had found a new sense of purpose and joy that she hadn't known in years. Margaret didn't need the approval of John or Eliza anymore. She had her own happiness to cultivate, and she was doing just that. For the first time in a long time, she felt free, and that was enough.